Welcome everyone. This is Catherine Franke from Columbia Law School, and I'm just so excited to have you all join us wherever you are. I hope you're somewhere safe and your families are safe. And this is an incredibly challenging time for all of us, and for those who are not well or are sick or are in other challenging sorts of situations. We send our love and our care out to everyone. We were supposed to have this symposium in person today, and thankfully all of our panelists agreed to do it as a webinar. And I am just so excited to welcome you and welcome our panelists, and most importantly, honor this great new book from Michele Goodwin, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. It's the culmination of years of research and expertise that Professor Goodwin has really distinguished herself in as someone thinking critically about pregnancy, motherhood, the state, the use of the criminal laws to punish particularly women of color. And so we'll have an hour and a half here today to talk about the book, to honor the book, to hear from her about why she wrote the book, and then also to hear from you. So what we're going to do in terms of format is I will introduce our panelists. We'll hear a little bit from Professor Goodwin about why she wrote the book. And then the five of us are going to have a conversation rather than just having talking heads talking at you. We're going to kind of have a dynamic, try to have a dynamic conversation between us about the work that each of our panelists do and how it intersects with this amazing book and why the book is so important. We will then take questions from you, and there is a button on your on the site for you to send us questions, and I will try to moderate those questions so that they go to the right person. But we're going to encourage all of you to send us your questions, concerns, issues you may have had in your own life with pregnancy, with racism in the healthcare system, with the intersection of healthcare and criminal justice. We've got a lot of you out there watching, and we're just thrilled to have you there. So let me first introduce our speakers. And if you don't know me, I'm a professor at Columbia Law School. I am the director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. I am not at Columbia Law School right now. I'm in the Catskills in upstate New York. This is the kind of programming we do at Columbia as part of our Gender and Sexuality Law program. And if any of you are interested in going to law school, Columbia is the place for you, although the other law schools that are represented here are fabulous also.
Right, everybody will have something to say about that.
So Michele Goodwin is a law professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. And indeed, she's a chancellor's professor of law, which is quite a wonderful honor that, that the UC system has recognized her with that chair or with that title. She's also the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at Irvine School of Law. And she'll talk to us a bit more, I hope, in a bit about what she's doing with that center. It's an incredibly important set of resources and expertise that she's developing there through that center. We also have Professor Chiara Bridges, who's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law recently. And so it's wonderful to have her join that faculty in Berkeley. Dahlia Lithwick, who is a senior legal correspondent with Slate. I'm sure many of you read her journalism, her reporting. She's been a reporter who has for years covered reproductive justice, gender justice, racial justice, and the courts. And we're thrilled to have her join us today. I will note, since she's sipping her tea, that she has been suffering from a very serious cold or flu and is here with us with somewhat of a cough. So if she has to mute her microphone now and then to deal with the cough, she will. But thank you so much, Dahlia, for joining us when you're not feeling so great. And then we have, lastly, but not at all leastly, my wonderful colleague, Carol Sanger, who is the Barbara Ehrenstein Black Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She has been my partner in all sorts of wonderful things at Columbia for many years. And it's just, well, we lost Carol for a second. There she is. But it is just wonderful to have Professor Sanger join us, who is also an expert in the law of abortion, the law of reproductive rights, and Professor Sanger will also talk about her book that's out, what, about 2 years now?
Yeah.
2 years or so on abortion. Go ahead, Carol.
No, I wasn't saying anything. Yes, about 2 years. Oh, you mean you want me to say something about it
Yeah.
now?
And so, not yet. I'm gonna turn to you in a second. So, Professor Goodwin's book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood, comes to us from Cambridge Press. It is just out this month or in the last few weeks. And in fact, it's been selling so fast that Professor Goodwin does not have a copy with her right now. She said that she's been doing book events and they've sold out at those book events. So she doesn't have one. I have one of the galleys. But among the things that she does in a nuanced, incredibly carefully detailed way, and in a way that draws in from a range of different disciplines, begins with storytelling, with the lives of women who have been so centrally affected by the increased criminalization of reproductive health care, who are, of course, lower income women of color. And so these stories, which are heartbreaking, infuriating, just devastating, that figure throughout the book, illustrate that this is not just an issue that is abstract in nature, it's an issue that affects people's lives every single day, where the most coercive parts of the state are used to regulate women's bodies, people's bodies, at a point when their bodies are so in need of health care, not police or jailing. So those stories come through the book, and then she says early in her preface, and I'm going to read from the book, sadly, these are not outlier incidents, but rather what has bled into the soil of reproductive politics in the United States, which now uses pregnancy as a proxy for punishment, particularly against poor women. So throughout the book, those women remain at the center of the story, at the center of the analysis, at the center of the concern and care that Professor Goodwin gives to this issue. But she also talks to us about how these women's lives operate as a kind of canary in the coal mine. They give us a lesson of what's at stake for the rest of us who may not be poor women of color. And part of what's so, I think, dynamic and careful and ethical about the book is that she honors the lives of the most vulnerable women, puts them at the center, but that doesn't use it instrumentally to say, oh yes, and the rest of us should care about this as well. Their concerns remain the principal concerns of the book, then draws the rest of us into taking up this issue, this kind of call to action that she ends with. So if you haven't ordered the book yet, not from that an online company that is bleeding our bookstores dry, but from the publisher or from your smaller bookstores that need your business so badly right now, do so immediately. But I want to first invite Professor Goodwin to talk to us a little bit about why she wrote this book. Why was this book such an important thing for you to do at this point?
Well, first, thank you so much for being so nimble and resilient and bringing us all together virtually as we weren't able to be together physically. And on that point, let's practice physical distancing, but not social distancing. This is a way in which socially we can all be together. And I very much appreciate that. And also, our panelists today with my first book, Black Markets, Carol Sanger and Pat Williams also did something very similar. We were able to be together at Columbia, but that was lovely, and this is too. And so I'm happy to be with you all, and Professor Bridges, and also Dahlia Lithwick. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. So I appreciate the opening, Catherine, and what motivated this book. I'll be honest, when I first began working on this, I was actually doing work on assisted reproductive technologies, and I was doing ongoing work on organ and tissue transplantation policy. I saw, tremendous demand there for the supplies associated with the human body, and then followed the money and followed any number of other things, and saw that the people who were most left out happen to be people of color. And so that's where I was when I first began thinking about these issues 2 decades ago, believe it or not. And what I began to see is that as the technologies associated with assisted reproductive technologies, which so many people use and should be able to use, but was really not being mined in sophisticated ways. And one of the ways in which it wasn't really being mined was to think about the challenges associated with the technologies and the deaths that were associated with it, and the disabilities that could arise after multiple births that were really not being tracked by the state or federal government, with the exception of clinics just simply having to report what were called success rates. And that was it. At the same time, what I noticed is that there was a pernicious level of policing that was taking place involving poor women, mostly across the South, but not exclusively. And there were women that were being arrested for miscarrying or for having a stillbirth. And what was very interesting is to see what I thought of as a time as a sort of tale of two different cities, with the increased fetal gestations that are associated with multiple births. Quite commonly, there were individuals who would, lose their babies. And the response to the demise of babies after aggressive use of assisted reproductive technology was essentially prayers, websites being created to support them, money coming in from all across the country and the world. The response was, well, God was involved in this and God just didn't want this to happen right now. And now let's give you a house, let's give you a van, let's give money and let's set up websites. On the other hand, it was really the tale of the bad mother that was befalling, poor women who'd have a miscarriage. And very often prosecutors were using linguistics associated with, or the justifications that if the baby had been born alive, it would have been low birth weight. And that's kind of interesting, considering that in the case of multiple gestations, if 4 babies being gestated at once, they're all low birth weight. If that's the justification for criminalization, well, that doesn't really hold up. And in the end, the science just didn't hold up anyway, right? Miscarriages and stillbirths happen for any number of reasons. What prosecutors were doing at the time was to use existing drug laws or child abuse statutes or anything that they could hold on to justify their prosecutions. And they were uniquely singling out women of color, right? And so one last thing that I'll say before wrapping up this introduction is that this kind of selective prosecution was taking place that relied upon nurses and doctors also surrendering their fiduciary responsibilities and obligations to the patients. It also meant that nurses and doctors and police and prosecutors were selectively targeting Black and brown women because they don't use drugs at any different rate during pregnancy than do white women. But it was very clear. In fact, there was data that, a Black woman who would inform her doctor of some prior drug use during pregnancy was 10 times more likely than a white woman to have social services called on her, and also police. So it's very clear that this was a kind of racialization taking place. And one final, sort of factoid that drove me at the very beginning to think about this was the fact that research showed that, increasingly through the 1980s and 90s, the more educated, wealthy, well-off a white woman was during her pregnancy, the more likely that she was using prescription medications during her pregnancy. And what I'm talking about here are cocktails of Oxycontin, Demerol, and so forth. And so this data, I had this data available to me. And what was very interesting is that as I would try to tell other scholars about this was before people accepted the fact that white people use opioids and were being prescribed opioids, and that these opioids could be dangerous and harmful to them. I was writing about this, I was thinking about this, but no one wanted to hear it. And so over time, this sort of book has been its own journey of a kind of frustration and pain of seeing what was happening, hoping that others would get involved in writing this, and then coming to the point where I felt that I needed to write it. And then at the point in which I needed to write it, it turned out that things would just get worse and worse year after year. So there was more to add. A book that I thought I'd finish within about 18 months, 2 years, that's it, and it's done. It just turned out that things continued to shatter all around the place, and there was just more to add to the book and more context and content. So thank you very much. And now we're here to talk about it. And now I think it's apparent to many people what's going on in the United States.
Well, I think this is one of the challenges of writing a book that is so current, is that as you're writing it, the landscape around you is changing and developing, and it's somewhat hard to say to yourself, okay, it's done, I'm going to publish it now, when you can just keep adding new things to the book, and unfortunately new horrors. We're not seeing any of the terrible situations that you describe in the book getting any better for the most part. But one of the things as a historian myself, that I found so compelling is that in a number of places during the story that you tell us in the book, the arc of the book, you say this is not new, right? The regulation of women's bodies, the use of coercive methods to control particularly Black women's bodies has been with us as long as the United States has been around, if not earlier. And you have a through line from the enslavement of Black women through the eugenics movement much later to today, and you say all of these are connected. And I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about the connections between the more recent cases that you document in the book, the eugenics movement before it, and then slavery itself, and how important regulating Black women's bodies was to slavery.
Thank you for that. So let's begin with Sojourner Truth and the speech that most people associate with her, "Ain't I a Woman?" And what most people recognize in that speech and what's replayed over time is that she talks about how strong she is, or that no one respects her as they respect white women, or opens a carriage door for her. But what's missed, and what it seems to be kind of lost, but it is there prominently in her speech, is that she says, "And I bore 13 children, and nearly each one snatched from my arms, and nobody heard my cry but God. Ain't I a woman?" And it's interesting to think about how that's just been lost. What people recognize is that, oh, she was strong and nobody opened up a carriage door. But she's talking about reproductive justice. She's talking about reproductive health, and she's talking about reproductive rights right there, right? She's our heroine that we could shape a whole entire movement around, because it's right there. And if you think about that speech itself, it connects us to these times of children being separated from their parents at our borders. And it's ironic to me that it's the ACLU, and I happen to serve on the executive committee of the National ACLU, but it's ironic that it's been the National ACLU that's been put in charge of finding parents and putting them back in contact with their kids. What does that mean when you have a government, the judiciary, that finds no confidence in the executive to actually find parents and put them back in touch with the children that they've snatched away from their arms, and the children that have been put in cages and given frozen burritos to eat? This trajectory, this history over time of the suffering that people have had, people who are, let's say, the less desirable, the vulnerable of our society. We can see that through slavery and what happened to Indigenous women being marched off of their lands and placed into reservations. But we see that in what we could also call a more modern arc of a century ago with eugenics, right? So this practice during slavery, which we don't spend enough time on, we really don't. And I appreciate you bringing that to this conversation, right? It's in all of its many different horrors. But then we can think about, eugenics, leaving slavery. And before eugenics is an important point that I want to make, which is that when we think about the sort of legal frameworks that have been developed, right, to handcuff women and reproduction, it's interesting that around the time at the end of slavery, where about 100% of reproductive health care is being controlled and done by women, there's the rise of gynecology as a science. And Horatio Storer, Joseph DeLee are these guys who have been trained as gynecologists and obstetricians, and they feel very much embarrassed by male doctors who tell them they're just doing women's work. And if you read their work at the time, part of the initial breakdown of reproductive rights is led by these new wave of obstetricians and gynecologists who want to monopolize reproductive health care for themselves. And they use organizations like the American Medical Association to leverage it. Anti-immigration campaigns, anti-midwifery campaigns, campaigns to make abortion illegal. And the AMA goes along. They lead the state campaigns. They also lead the federal campaigns. And so it's a kind of perfect storm. But then, to speed up to eugenics, it's nearly a century ago when the US Supreme Court in 1927 sanctions a Virginia law that calls for the forcible sterilization of people who are considered socially and morally and mentally unfit. And it's interesting to think about that case itself, because it's a case that involves a poor white girl who's 16, who's been raped by her employer's nephew. She becomes pregnant after this rape, and the state of Virginia has this program where it's institutionalizing people at what it calls the Virginia colony. And at this place, they're sterilizing people as young as 12 and 11 and 10 years old. And Carrie becomes the subject of a test case. Her lawyer is actually a eugenicist himself, a eugenics sympathizer. And so the case really is about making sure that this is a legal platform that can be rolled out across all states. And with the Supreme Court sanctioning it, that's what happens. More than 30 states adopt eugenics laws that provide for the compulsory sterilization of individuals. In the case, Justice Holmes says that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, that the authority that the state has to impose vaccination is broad enough to cover, quote, snipping the fallopian tube. He says that better than to let them start their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. What's important to note about that horrific case is not only the tens of thousands of Americans who then are sterilized against their will, the way in which it then becomes used on Black girls in the South, euphemistically called a Mississippi appendectomy, where their parents don't even know what's happening to them. They're told, just we need your daughters overnight. Their daughters being sterilized without parents even knowing. But this also becomes the platform that's picked up for the Nazis in Germany. Their eugenics law is based on the US law, and that too is lost to history. So as you welcome me to kind of tie this thread from the old to the new, what we see now is in fact a part of this program, and what you see is inconsistency over time. That's why there's really nothing legitimate about these times. The reproductive space is just simply a political football. There are times in which the state says we don't want poor people to be reproducing at all. There's eugenics, right? We'll strip this completely away from you. There are other times in which the state will sanction private entities forcing people to reproduce, such as slavery. And now in these times, the anti-abortion times, is when the state cracks down and now suddenly has a care for fetal life. Very inconsistent, but the one consistent thing is using women's bodies as property, and the state using its authority and power over the control of women and their destinies.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. I want to invite Kara Bridges to kind of join us in this discussion of how the toxic cocktail, if you will, of white supremacy and patriarchy is brought to bear to regulate women's bodies. It's figured so prominent, those ideas have figured so prominently in your own work. You and I met when you were doing your field work for your dissertation at the hospital down the street from Columbia Law School, studying the kind of reproductive health care women in New York were getting in a hospital. So I want to invite you to also try to connect these dots between the eugenics, and what we're seeing today, and the way that white supremacy has really structured American society and law since before our founding.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and it's an honor to be a part of this conversation. I think that what Professor Goodwin, Michelle's book does so beautifully is to situate the laws that she's analyzing, these fetal protection laws, in a context, in a historical context, but also a context in which the fetus is venerated over the bodies and the humanity of the people who are actually doing the gestating of the fetus. And so when that sort of veneration of the fetus and derogation of the people who actually sustain the fetus, when that happens in a context of, centuries of anti-Black racism, when that happens in a context of the moral construction of poverty, blaming people for their indigence as opposed to looking to structural causes of impoverishment and immiseration, when that happens, it creates horrors, right? And I mean, that's one thing that's so powerful about the book, is that Michele does not at all, she forces us to confront the inhumanity of fetal veneration, essentially. And so, the way that it speaks to my own work. So as you mentioned, Catherine, I did an ethnography. I spent 18 months in an obstetrics clinic in New York City, where all of the patients there received Medicaid in order to pay for their prenatal care. And there's a similar mechanism happening in the hospital. It's not, I'll be plain that it's not nearly as horrific as the stories and the laws that Michele analyzes in Policing the Womb, but there's a similar mechanism whereby fetuses are venerated over the women who are doing the gestating, which is happening in our public hospitals and our public obstetrics clinics all over the nation. And so what I've analyzed in my work is just how we err on the side, and Michelle's book will tell you, we err ineffectively on the side of protecting fetuses while completely disregarding any privacy interests that poor mothers would have, any autonomy interests that they would have, their dignity interests, their humanity. And so that plays out in the obstetrics clinics that I analyzed, just through a wholesale evacuation of women's privacy, their ability to determine the course of their health care, the ability to keep the state out of their lives, the state that purports to be interested in protecting children and ensuring children's welfare. It becomes impossible for poor women to enjoy the simple fact of being able to close one's door to the state that wealthier women enjoy in our country. So there's definitely a through line between the horrors that are documented in Michelle's book, In the Name of Fetal Protection, and the tragedies that I document in my own work that's also done in the name of fetal protection.
Thank you so much. Carol, I'd want to invite you for a moment to talk about what some of the strongest takeaways for you were of Michelle's new book. But as Kara was talking, I also think about how the fetishization of the fetus figured in your own book about abortion. And there's such connections between by Kara's work, Michelle's work, and your work in that respect. But I do want to bring you into the conversation to just give an homage to policing, the policing narrative and the story of policing the womb that Michele offers us.
Okay, so there's this book.
Yes.
There's this book. Whoops.
There's Carol's book.
And it's there somewhere. And they read interestingly together, as well as with Reproducing Race, Chiara's first book. And I wanted to say something about Policing the Womb first, which was, I was very suspicious when I opened it up and I saw that the headings were like section 5.3, section 1.7.8, And I thought, is this what they make you do at Cambridge University Press? You know, you have to have it so organized and so what seemed to me very dry, but no worry there, because the book is wonderful to read, and you feel like you are being led by an author, which is something I aspire to, and you accomplished. And what was so good was, while I felt like you were representing the readers and you were representing the subjects of the stories and the cases. And so it was like, once you got in, there was a kind of solidarity. And I found that very powerful, where you showed compassion and you showed outrage. You offered solace and you showed shock. So that it was and constantly throughout the book. So it was never that you were in a safe zone exactly, but you knew you were being accompanied by you. One, the reader knew she was being accompanied by you, and I found that very helpful. There are a couple things that I noticed. One, as Catherine just pointed out, my book centers a lot on figuring out how the fetus got to be so precious, and how it displaced women, and how it when you say the invisible women, I mean, I think of that in a particular way, but women are, you know, we have the case which you discussed 2 points in the book of Marlene in Texas.
Yes, Marlene Munoz.
Yeah, Munoz, who was EMS, who collapsed and died and was brain dead, and yet the hospital that was asked by her husband to please take her off the ventilators and everything else refused. And under Texas law, they were entitled to do that, although they weren't, and they ultimately got overruled. And she became the incubator for her fetus. And there are now laws in most states that say women who signed an advance directive, they're no good if you're pregnant. So we have work for you to do, ladies, which is be dead and keep functioning, and we'll keep your organs going and until we can pull a kid out. And of course, it rarely works. But that struck me as a good example of the invisible or the fading woman for her fetus, even when her husband and the grandparents and Munoz herself had not wanted this to happen, and had very clearly indicated that. So my book has more perhaps on how we've come to think about the fetus, the work that ultrasound does to humanize it for us, and so on. And I won't go into all of that, but one other part that I found that your book made me think, I wish there was more on, not by you, but your book is like an invitation for people in the field, was prosecutorial discretion. Since we're talking about policing, we're talking about somebody making the decision that a case should be prosecuted. And we've seen it most recently, I suppose, in the arrests of mostly young women who had stillbirths, and they decide that the baby was born alive and then was killed, as opposed to being born dead. And it seems to me that's an area where that prosecutorial discretion strikes me as extremely related to another issue, which is a theme of your book, which is the narrative story. Because you have to ask, how do prosecutors come to this view that she probably killed it? What's their starting point that's the place you get so quickly? And you can say, well, it's political. We need a case. We need a law and order case. And note that the law and order now focuses on women and reproduction. But there's a reason why people don't. There are reasons why people so quickly associate women with evil behavior. That we won't go back to what's her name, Eve. But is where the word evil came from. No, it didn't. But we're used to think, and I think that the big connection there is sex. And you have a lot in the book about sex, but it seems to me that's a hugely important link. And so I spent time in my book trying to argue that we have to change the narrative, and that can only happen if women speak up. And I don't mean shout out necessarily, although I am a big Lindy West fan, but to speak even to a relative, a niece who's having a problem, and to tell somebody that you're pregnant and in 10th grade, or that you want to have an abortion. So there are, and that can only happen through a series of confidences and someone making it all right to speak up. And so far, and we see in changes like this happen, we've seen there can actually be social change, social movement, create different views. A non-reproductive view would be, look what happened to smokers. I mean, how did smokers, who used to be among the sexiest of the sexy, you know, in movies and such, and up until the 70s, suddenly become, you know, really wicked and children dislike them? And that was a carefully plotted social movement, not by the smokers, but by the state more. And you can, so we have that example. We have, when did it become all right to support a marriage equality? It took somebody to say, you know, I still love my nephew. So it's the coming out, self coming out, and the absorption of that by family members. And I have a kind of trickle up argument that you start small and personal, it moves to social conversation, it moves to public conversation, and then maybe to policy at the end. Be nice if it were coming, but in any case, it's possible to do it, but it requires a lot of bravery. When you think of what your subjects have suffered, one thinks, why do they need to do anything else? Why do they need to talk more or be interviewed or be the public face of something? So it's slow because it ought to be, and we have to be careful about that burden. But those were some of the links I saw between your book and mine, and some of the things I wanted to dig deeper in after reading your book. Prosecutorial, you know, discretion and how that works, and figuring out more to how one changes the narrative.
And Carol, if I could add just right in there, if you wouldn't mind, which is that, you know, one of the areas in which law has become the most innovative is in this area. So, you know, most of us are law professors. You're an honorary one, Dahlia, given as many of us that you work with, right? But what we know is that our students, you come away from 3 years of law school, an average student who takes the average courses, and maybe at most, at the end of it, they've maybe read 3 deeply edited, maybe 5, these like say 7 at the very most, deeply edited cases that relate anything to women's lives at all.
Oh, yes.
At all, out of 3 years, out of hundreds of cases that they've read, maybe 7, usually probably around 5. 3 probably for sure, and that's it. And what's interesting is that that's just one piece, but in another piece, what's also fascinating is that of the cases that they're going to read, and let's just look at the first year of law, they're going to read so many cases about trains and injuries. They're going to be reading cases about the 1600s over and over and over again. And what's fascinating is that the area of the law that's most dynamic is the area about women being punished. Right? And like the many different new ways to go after women and girls. That's where legal innovation, sadly, is actually taking place. And so maybe we'll get to that a bit later in this conversation, but that's one of the things that I found in this book. Old laws being used in new ways against women, new laws being created. You know, let's see if we can impose the death penalty against a woman who has an at-home abortion. Okay, well, if the death penalty doesn't work, what other kinds of criminal punishments can we get through this legislature? So yeah,
And
it's a lot to unpack there.
Well, that's really helpful about the first year, but I would also enlist tort professors where there's not enough work on what constitutes harm to women. And so there's a wonderful article by Martha Chamalis and Linda Kerber on how women couldn't get compensation for having a miscarriage if they were in a buggy that bounced around, and I can't remember exactly what, but that was considered not a harm, that you would lose your pregnancy. So
well, they can't get compensation for Flint, Michigan.
For what?
Flint, Michigan.
Yeah.
Right.
And that you mentioned Flint, this is going to open it up for someone else, goes to the issue of one of the things we were talking about was, I think was in one of Catherine's questions, was reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I began teaching a course a few years ago called Reproductive Law. How flat is that? And now I taught it 2 years ago. It was called Reproductive Rights and Practices. And then I added in the Ross and Solinger book, and you have to add in reproductive justice. And I thought that's enough. That's enough adjectives. But those are the three things: justice, the law, if we have it, rights, which the law and the rights are often in competition because we have this elaborate regulatory state, which seems to override any rights we're talking about. And then the concept of justice, as in Flint, and they really expand the notion of what it takes, what reproductive justice should consider. It's the way you're entitled to raise a child under just circumstances.
So I want to come back to this issue of the distinction between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, which figures so importantly in Michelle's book. And we'll do that in a couple of minutes, but I want to invite Dahlia into the conversation and ask you two quick questions. One, just to weigh in about why this is exactly the right time for this book to come out and why it's so important. And secondly, which member of the Supreme Court do you want reading this book right now?
Wow. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, and I'm going to apologize because my voice is awful and I'm going to cough. And I also want to say that I don't know what's making that awesome noise. Okay. I think I also just want to say
airplane.
That was cool.
Airplane up the Hudson.
This book, you know, Catherine, when you introduced it, you said it's still moving. I mean, Michele could be writing codas and addenda even post-publication. And I think I read a draft a few months ago, and then I read it again a few weeks ago. And I was so aware of how the landscape has even changed in the intervening months. And so I think just the only 2 points I want to make are just connected to what we've all been talking about. In terms of the Supreme Court and the docket and the change in the landscape that is happening in front of our eyes. If you think about the last 20 years of abortion restrictions and the trap laws that were all sort of driven by, you know, some of what Chiara's talking about, the fetishization of the mother and the fetus, and the idea
Dahlia,
that,
explain what a trap law is for not everybody. We've got over 200 people listening, by the way. So welcome everybody. So explain that.
Good point. This is why I'm not a law professor, as I start in the middle. Trap laws, it stands for targeted restrictions of abortion providers. And essentially after 1992, after the Casey decision, it became easier to regulate abortion providers than it did to actually regulate abortion. And so you started to see the kinds of laws that we're now seeing happening right in the Louisiana cases, where under the auspices of, oh, abortion is fine and legal, we just want women to be safe, and we want them to make good choices, and we want them to have full information. And so you start start to see a whole panoply of laws, whether it's the forcing providers to get admitting privileges at clinics they don't need, or the retrofitting the clinics so that they look like ambulatory surgical units, which is what the court struck down 3 years ago in Texas. But it's a whole host of laws that don't say we want to punish women because they're bad. What they say is women are just making bad choices and abortion doctors are not helping them make good choices. So we're going to just sort of retrofit the world so they do things better. And that was the landscape, very much blessed, by the way, by Justice Kennedy, who said, women they're just frail little creatures and they make poor choices. And so it's incumbent on men, particularly me, Anthony Kennedy, to help them make better decisions. And that was the lay of the land until, and this is why Michelle's book is so important, in the last year, when you see this host of laws that are purely punitive, right? You see Texas legislature debating whether maybe it should be a capital crime for a woman to abort a fetus. And you're seeing all over the country, states falling all over themselves to pass laws not to help women make good decisions, but to just punish them because they're bad. And I think that slip happened so quickly that we almost missed it. If you blinked, you missed the fact that abortion regulations stopped being dressed up as just trying to make abortion clinics safer and helping women have full information to, we're going to punish women and doctors because abortion is bad. And I think that's incredibly essential, because to miss that move as it happened this past year is really to miss, I think, the canaries in the coal mine point. This is where abortion is going, and it's going to go there very quickly. So I think that's one point that I think Michele is flagging that has actually really changed, even in the months since her book went to print. The other thing that I think is really important, and Michele started with this, but I want to pull on the thread a little bit if I can, Catherine, and that is just the role of doctors. Because the book is very, very clear in laying out the history. She describes how white male OBGYNs kind of crashed onto the scene. They pushed midwives aside. They turned it into a licensed profession in which many, many women of color were pushed aside who were acting as midwives. And it became a very professionalized relationship, and not always at the best interest of the mother. Wow. What's important in this history is that Roe is, and Michele goes into this in great detail, and again, we forget, when you read Roe v. Wade, Justice Blackmun uses the word physician more than he uses the word woman. The physician is more important in Roe than the woman ever is. And so what Justice Blackmun does in Roe is lashes the interests of the woman and her physician together in a way that is mistaken for 1,000 reasons, and we can talk about it. I think it's clearly the case that Roe is more protective of the physician's interests in a lot of ways than of the mother's interests, and assumes that they're perfectly aligned. And this is important. Justice Ginsburg goes on to say this was not the place you wanted to locate rights. You did not want to locate them in this in the due process and the privacy doctrine. You wanted to do it in equal protection. Michele talks about that too. The only thing I want to point out is that Michele's book ends where we all missed it, which is now we've got doctors and nurses being conscripted to work against the interests of their patients. Right. And that the presumption, the fundamental presumption of Roe, which is that doctors' interests and women's interests are perfectly aligned, whether or not that was wrong-headed, that is being ripped apart now, not by the doctrine, but by the reality of telling doctors, you have to report if a woman pees into a cup and there's some evidence of drug use. And that's a move, again, that we are seeing happening on the national level. The best example of that is a few weeks ago in June Medical, where the court is actually for the first time talking about stripping third-party standing away from doctors. Doctors cannot bring, if Justice Clarence Thomas gets his way, they cannot bring cases on behalf of pregnant women. Why? Because Justice Alito at argument said, and Justice Thomas has written, that those interests are so anathema, that doctors are so interested in undermining the rights of their patients that they cannot be aligned. And so I just want to say that those two moves have happened in the pendency of the writing of this book. That the idea that we're going to draw, throw a wedge between a woman and her abortion provider as a doctrinal matter, that is a radically new proposition that we are now seeing happen, both in the abortion context and, as Michele says, in the criminal context. And that other initial move of just, I think, saying we're going to do away with the notion that we want women to make good choices because they're vulnerable creatures. We would like to throw them in jail. That is also a move that has happened really in the past year in dramatic ways. As to your second question, Catherine, I think that the justice that most needs to read this book is the only justice that matters, who is John Roberts. Because I think we have 4 justices on the court who are profoundly committed to ending Roe or Casey. How they do it is a different question. And I think John Roberts is very, very much of a sort of old school view of that trap law view that we are protecting women. And I think that this book makes the point that an awful lot of that which is done under the guise of protecting women actually harms them. And that's where Chiara started.
So here's everyone's project. Assignment is to order the book, Policing the Womb, and send it to Justice Roberts. Let's just overwhelm him with copies, and he can share them with others as holiday gifts later on. But I think having him have a copy in all the desks in which he's working would be really important. So thank you for those insights, Dahlia. And I want to invite you to say one other thing, which takes us back to the eugenics point earlier. You were critical of Justice Kennedy, of Justice Alito, and we're trying to bring along Chief Justice Roberts. But Justice Thomas's approach to issues of reproductive rights and or justice, and abortion in particular, is inflected with this particular history of eugenics in the African American community. And I want to draw you out a little bit for just brief comments on how that concern has distorted so much of the way that he approaches these issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those things that seemed like a crackpot idea when he started floating it, and is really leaching into mainstream discourse. And I think it really goes to, the way the legal academics talk about this is how ideas go from off the wall to on the wall, and how quickly that happens. This is an absolutely crackpot idea that Justice Thomas has increasingly introduced into the debate. And he has made a point. He did it most, I think, explicitly and deeply last year in Box versus Planned Parenthood. This was an Indiana case that, by the way, a case that the court is seen as having sort of split the difference because they only upheld a fetal remains law that was bonkers, but because they struck down the sort of, you don't get to have selective abortion based on wishing to terminate certain pregnancies, the court is seen as having somehow done the right thing. And I think it tells you how far we've come when that didn't even raise an eyebrow, that the court just blessed an absolutely pointless and very costly proposition that women who have terminated a pregnancy have to shell out $1,000 to bury the remains. But bracketing that, Justice Thomas, unrelated to anything, tacked on a 20-page dissent in which he, and this goes to Michelle's original conversation about eugenics, really tried very hard to retrofit history so that he was saying that the eugenics movement and the abortion movement and the birth control movement, which is he's on better footing when he talks about birth control, but sort of throwing all those things into the same pot and saying that you can draw a straight line between the, despicable eugenics movement that Michele describes in the Carrie Buck case to the abortion movement today. And all of it is because people want to do away with Black and brown babies. It's the exact same project. And he leans heavily on Adam Cohen's history, which is a phenomenal history of the eugenics movement, all of which is ahistorical and wrong. I think almost every history professor who's looked at it, Michele can speak to this more eloquently than I, but everyone who's looked at it has said this is profoundly historically wrong. But he's trying to sort of do a flip in which he says that all that was contemptible and wrong about the eugenics movement and the way it was used, particularly with respect to Black and brown babies, is the exact same thing. It is the same project and the same plan as the abortion movement is today. And it's just worth, I guess, Catherine, this was your question, and I could have started with just this. One was a government effort to get rid of unwanted babies. The other is a question of personal autonomy and choice. And the implication that those are in any way connected is not just, as I said, a historic, but I think it's really, really dangerous, because it's laying the groundwork for a sort of politically correct argument about, I'm just doing this because I'm worried about Black mothers and their children. And those are the people who are going to stand to lose the most if we continue to shutter clinics around the country.
Right. You know, Michele, the book does so many things, and all of them very well. But one of the things that the book does is offer a really sustained and pretty scathing critique of advocacy struggles or advocacy strategies that we're all pretty familiar with, that figure abortion rights at the center of a reproductive rights campaign. So I'd like you to say a little bit more about that critique of that strategy, and then invite Kiera to perhaps reflect on that also and see if you agree, and have a similar critique of the way in which abortion rights has kind of eclipsed the full range of issues that would come into focus if we had a more reproductive justice way of approaching these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, right? You know, it gets to the heart of the notion of invisibility, right? So if we begin with thinking about a Sojourner Truth, Marion Sims, who's the gynecologist whose statue adorned Central Park until recently, but who did the most tortuous experimentation on enslaved Black women, and then hailed by those in the field of gynecology. I mean, it's in many ways it kind of epitomized, you know, what invisibility means. I remember reading Marion Sims's autobiography for my first book, and what was fascinating is how much he was hailed as such as a hero. And so as I began reading this book at around 2003, 2004, I'm horrified as he talks about having epiphanies in the middle of the night. And these epiphanies leading him to rouse Anarcha and Lucy and other Black women as enslaved in the back of his house. And then he begins to talk about how he would lacerate into their, you know, uteri, cut them up, cut them open in all sorts of ways, deny them any anesthesia because he firmly believed that Black women did not feel pain, and if they did, they were not deserving of any kind of sensitivity. And then it was very interesting, you know, then to think about who reads what and who responds how. Right? So many who had read his book over time thought that he was brilliant enough to put a statue of him. He was not from New York. He was actually from South Carolina, where there are statues of him that still exist and are up. But clearly people thought enough of him that in this prime real estate of New York is let's put a statue up, you know, in Central Park honoring him. And so invisibility ends up mattering quite a bit to all of this. And so the notion of centering abortion rights as reproductive rights, making it almost synonymous, is something that in a lot of ways leads us to the unraveling, the undoing that we see now, right? So if we were to think about a civil rights movement, you know, civil rights weren't based just around Brown, right? It wasn't that activists, those who cared about these issues, thought that Brown was just it and now let's all go home. 1954, we've scored it all with the potential promise of there being desegregation in education. No, it was understood that a civil rights movement meant rights across multiple areas. It's not just education, it's housing, it's swimming pools and parks, it's employment, it's every aspect of life in which people of color, Black people in particular, had been denied what had been afforded to them by the US Constitution. And if we were to think about the reproductive rights space, this kind of consolidating all around abortion clearly leaves out the full spectrum of what a reproductive health, what a life is for people who experience, you know, every aspect of what a body does, right? Whether it's menstruation, puberty, the desire to terminate a pregnancy, the desire to continue a pregnancy, the sort of prenatal agenda there, the postnatal agenda there, menopause. There's so many aspects of that life. There's venereal disease, there's so much. But if life is constrained, or how we understand reproductive rights as being just around abortion, then there's so much that we miss. Now, in particular, what I see as a significant problem, and where in many ways the movement itself, shackled itself, was the failure to see the lives of Black and brown women and people who are indigent and struggling and non-documented as being part of the movement. Now, in the book, I talk about the case of Captain, Struck, who was in the military and wanted to carry a pregnancy to term. This was before Roe. And the military gives her an ultimatum. She has 48 hours to terminate her pregnancy. So this is very interesting. What a lot of people might not know is that in the US military, abortions were totally legal and fine before Roe. In fact, that was what was imposed. If you're a woman, you're in the military, you get pregnant, you're having an abortion if you want to stay in the military. She fought to keep her pregnancy, and each time she was denied being able to stay in the military and keep a pregnancy. So ultimately she did carry her pregnancy to term. She gave the child up for adoption. And by the time that this is happening and the ACLU is taking up her case, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of the lawyers on the case, the military decides to just drop it, right? So ultimately Captain Struck is able to stay in the military, but not with her child. She gives her child up for adoption. That should be part of the story, but where we really see the tensions between reproductive rights and reproductive justice happens to be, we can look at that over the arc of time from Sojourner Truth on up, but if we were to think about it post-Roe, right, what should this space look like, right? Then we see that if you're poor, you're left out. And then quite visibly, what we see is that during the era of the sort of, we're ongoing in a drug war, but if we were to look at this kind of intersection of the kind of perfect storms coming together of drug war and Black woman sentiment that's kind of bound up in the welfare queen rhetoric that's launched by Ronald Reagan. And it's interesting as a side note of history to just note that, Governor Reagan launches his political campaign for presidency from Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is ironic because why would any California governor do that? But what is Philadelphia, Mississippi known for? Most people associated with one thing, and it's the tragic, brutal deaths of 3 civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 3 young men who went to Mississippi. Cheney was already there in order to help people register to vote. But anyway, this kind of perfect confluence, right, of the kind of welfare queen rhetoric, the drug war, culminates in the crack bomb, the crack baby. Black women ultimately being dragged out of hospitals in shackles and chains after they admit to their providers and just provide health information that maybe they did use crystallized cocaine during their pregnancies. And the scenes are horrific. They kind of hark back to slavery. The Medical University of South Carolina created a clandestine campaign, one to lure women in who were substance users, telling them that they would have access to prenatal care, and then turning over their medical information to police and to prosecutors, and literally women being dragged out in shackles and chains and bloodied gowns, giving birth in prison toilets and so forth. That's just one example, and many others across the country. But where this solidifies then, right, in a critique of the reproductive rights movement, a very strong critique in the book, is that these women are not seen as being the beneficiaries of Roe, the kind of beneficiaries of a rights movement that understands that they have a right to dignity, they have a right to equality, a right to privacy, in their caring of their decision to be pregnant and carry to term, and that these women should also be included under the promise of a reproductive right, under privacy and autonomy, and they're left behind. And they're left behind at a time like states like Wisconsin adopting laws that provide for the forced civil confinement of women who are, for any reason, but triggered by women who are perceived to use crystallized cocaine during their pregnancies. And there's so much more. I want to leave room for Chiara to speak to this, because she does too, and this brilliant ethnographic work that she does, which looks at how people in the medical profession, how their gaze falls upon poor women and women of color. And so the book, yes, it takes that step. And one last thing I will say is that in many ways, if you look at the state's ways in which they're now legitimizing their criminal attacks on women, it's through a kind of personhood, seeing this kind of fetishization of embryos and fetuses and kind of embracing a personhood in them. But this is launched back in the 1980s and 90s against Black and brown women. It's part of the justification. Prosecutors at that time and police, are using, they're applying a kind of linguistic of personhood to the fetus and used against these women. And so a failure to recognize these women was also, a failure to recognize what was happening in law at that time that they should be worried about.
Great. So Chiara, I see you nodding a lot in response to things that Michelle's saying. So what do you think about these issues?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the critique is an appropriate one, and the critique that I'm referring to is the critique that reproductive rights has been too narrow. The reproductive rights movement has been too narrow. The reproductive rights movement has been concerned with abortion to the exclusion of all the other reproductive issues that a person encounters in their life. As Michele mentioned, everything from STIs to menopause to the ability to access, tampons and pads when you're on your period, right? All of that stuff ought to be an aspect of the movement. And so, I want to tie. So I think that the reproductive justice framework is more justice enhancing than the reproductive rights movement has been. The reproductive rights movement has worked wonders for those whose only impediment to controlling their destinies is the ability to access abortion services in the market. But for those who face other impediments, we've needed a widening of the lens of concerns that we ought to be agitating towards. And so I want to just tie that claim to something Dahlia mentioned about Justice Thomas's concern about Black women all of a sudden in his box concurrence most directly. And so, part of Justice Thomas's concern is that Black women disproportionately use abortion services. The empirics are out there, the data's out there, the stats are there. Black women disproportionately rely on abortion services. And I think that, and if you look at June Medical Services versus, I think it's Russo now, which the court will tell us what they're going to do with regard to the Louisiana law that closed 2 out of 3 abortion clinics in the state. But if you look at the numbers in Louisiana specifically, Black women over-rely on abortion services, right? So the reality is that closing abortion clinics impacts Black women. So to deny that abortion ought to be a concern of reproductive justice, like reproductive justice cares about other things. We just care about the ability to have a kid or to raise one kid with dignity. It undermines, it elides that the ability to not have a kid, the ability to access abortion and contraception are central to reproductive justice's mission. And Louisiana makes that very clear, right? Because if Louisiana closes its abortion clinics, it's Black women who are going to be disproportionately coerced into motherhood. But I think what a reproductive rights frame would do with the fact that Black women over-rely on abortion services in Louisiana is celebrate it, It's actually to say, good, Black women are accessing this right. They're using, you know, the substantive due process has worked for them. They are accessing abortion. They're terminating their pregnancies. I think what a reproductive justice frame would do, that a reproductive rights framework would not do, is query why it is that Black women over-rely on abortion services in Louisiana. And the reason why Black women over-rely on abortion services in Louisiana has to do with racism. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with interpersonal violence. It has to do with the absence of healthcare, right? So if healthcare is not available to you, you're not going to be able to get contraception so that you can avoid the pregnancy in the first instance, right? If one's life is constrained by violence and poverty and inequity, then abortion becomes necessary. So I think what a reproductive justice framework does is not just take the fact of abortion taking place in Louisiana, for example, as a sign that abortion rights are working, but rather to interrogate what we can do in terms of like equality, in terms of justice, to make abortion not as necessary for the folks who are relying on it in Louisiana. So.
And I'd like to jump in there, if that's okay, Catherine, to just make a point that to add to the conversation about health. Let's be clear that a person is 14 times more likely to die in the United States by carrying a pregnancy to term. And that's really important because the stakes are high, so that when Justice Thomas or any of the justices want to use the power of their position to say, no, we want to rid this opportunity away, rid this medical technology away from the people who could use it. Let's be clear that a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying pregnancy to term than by termination. But then let's also be clear that maternal mortality, the United States leads the developed world in the rate of maternal mortality. And if our viewers right now were to go to the CIA website, that's the Central Intelligence Agency website, they would have to scroll down and they would see that the US ranks somewhere around 50th or 51st in the world in terms of keeping people safe during their pregnancies. That is, that there is a lower maternal death rate in Saudi Arabia than there is here, a lower maternal death rate in Bosnia than there is here. And if we were to look specifically at what Kiara was saying so brilliantly about what's going on in Louisiana and needing to go underneath the surface, we would learn that the rate of maternal mortality for Black women is nearly 4 times that of white women in the United States as a general matter, and it's even more dramatic in states like Mississippi and Louisiana and these other places. And so we are really talking about a life and death kind of agenda here. And that's not hyperbole when you're looking at rates that exceed, where you're looking at the rates of Black women's maternal mortality in some of these states exceeding the most rural and sometimes blighted areas of Kenya or the Congo. Right? And we have to really put that on the table on the map, because the governors and the legislators from those states aren't. They're not doing that. The very people who are doing this kind of pernicious legislating are not bothering to also show to the public the kind of significant health crisis that the women in their states are facing, even when they try to carry pregnancies to term.
So Carol, 1 second. I have so many more questions for all of you, but we only have about 15 more minutes.
Stop, really?
I know, how did that happen? And we also have some really great questions coming in from the folks who are watching. So I want to offer one of the questions / concerns that's come from one of our viewers and get your reactions. It's from a woman who, due to issues of domestic violence in her own life, had her child put into foster care by a city agency in New York City. Her child was, this is tragically not uncommon, was abused in foster care. She finally got him back. And she's now interested in having another child, and she's worried about delivering in a city hospital, and that the social workers and other city agents that will be there looking after the welfare of that child she may be risking having that child taken out of her custody as well. What kind of advice would you give to her as somebody who's being so monitored by state agencies in all aspects of her parenting? And I would invite you to think about this in terms of this distinction between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and the ways in which a justice model can understand parenting, not just birth and termination of a child, but actually parenting being part of what we ought to take into account when we think about justice. So whoever, Carol, I know you also teach family law in addition to thinking so much about reproduction and abortion and reproductive justice. So if you want to weigh in first and subtly weave in whatever it was you were about to say before, but it's a really pressing question from our viewer.
Yes, well, I'm glad that the viewer is not pregnant now, because I thought I read in the paper today that 2 New York hospitals were not delivering babies anymore. Did anybody see that? Because
no, you're not allowed to bring a person into the delivery room with you.
Oh, that's all it was?
Well, that's a lot.
I'm sorry, it said mothers must deliver alone. And the alone meant, when I read it, I thought, they're not even, you have to go deliver, in a bathroom. Anyway, okay, I get it. Thank you very much. So forget that. Yes, I would be concerned. I mean, they have your records, and that it is possible to have that happen. I don't know enough about the case, but I think that if I can abstract from the question, is the law is much closer to you than you ever think it is. So you think you're just having a baby and going to the hospital to do that, but in fact, you've been, as Chiara's work showed, sort of surveilled from the entire time you've been getting your prenatal care, and then during the birth, and also your history. I mean, there's a way that all of this sticks with you, and others may want to comment on this particular case.
I think I have one piece of very practical advice, and it might not work, but my best advice is to do the best that you can to deliver in a private hospital, because then at least at that point, you will get at least the presumption, and it depends on which private hospital you go to, but there might be a presumption that you have the same characteristics that we presume to attach to those who can access private insurance, those who are more affluent. And so, I think as Michelle's work so brilliantly shows, is that we make a lot of assumptions, not always deserved, about those with class privilege. Michelle has already mentioned that class privileged women, white women, are just as likely, if not more likely, to use controlled substances during their pregnancies. It's just different controlled substances, right? The ones that are used by poor women of color are illicit street drugs, but the ones that are used by the more affluent, the whiter women during their pregnancies are prescription drugs, equally, if not more harmful to fetal development. Nevertheless, we presume that women who are affluent know what's best for them. Women who are affluent will care for their fetuses. They have a natural maternal instinct. They won't harm their fetuses. And that those same assumptions are not available to those who are poor. So I think that my first book certainly offers no optimism about the prospect of being able to avoid the regulatory state during your pregnancy. If you have if you go to a public hospital, if you are on Medicaid, and if you have a history of intimate violence and a history of contact with with ACS and Child Protective Services, my first book offers little optimism about your ability to avoid a state that surveils and punishes poor people. But I think that the most practical of advices I could offer is just to see if you can take your insurance to a private hospital. So at least the assumptions that flow to affluent women, class privileged women, would flow to you.
And I would add one more to that, in addition to all of your viewers, making sure they have Kiara's books, her 2 books, but as well, contact the National Advocates for Pregnant Women. A few years ago, in a case involving a woman in Florida, they've handled thousands of cases, but a few years ago, when a woman wanted to give birth, vaginal delivery, and to try, she had C-sections prior to that, and her doctor wrote to her and said that she was leaving him with no other choice but to have police come to her home and drag her into the hospital so that he could force a C-section on her. In that case, she happened to have a lawyer. She was a white woman, middle-class white woman, and she contacted her lawyer, and her lawyer contacted National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and the doctor backed off. He suddenly realized that there were other choices than to have police go to her home and drag her into his hospital. So that's, I would suggest that you reach out to them as well.
We've also got comments coming in from other people viewing saying that the Center for Family Representation, Bronx Defenders, and Brooklyn Defenders, depending on what borough you're in and what borough the hospital is in, can also be wonderful resources for someone who's concerned about the state doing, horrendous overreaching and risking you having custody of your child in the circumstances that you wrote us about. So thank you for your question.
We're having a conversation. Right, that's the United States at this time, that someone has to write into this video webinar about fear of becoming pregnant and the potential of her child being taken away because she previously was in a domestic violence situation, something that many people experience in this country and fear coming publicly about or bringing public.
Yeah. So we have another person writing in with a question / concern about an issue in which the New York City Council had hearings recently having to do with drug testing in public hospitals for marijuana use among pregnant women. And I wondered if any of you wanted to reflect on that. Dahlia, I don't know if you've covered the issue. Kiara, these are the hospitals in which you were doing your work. Carol, you of course have also thought and written about these issues. Any of you would want to weigh in on that practice with a supposedly progressive mayor who is supposed to be taking a very different approach to these issues, but seems not to be. Any of you?
Sigh.
Well, I mean, I think that the fact of drug testing for marijuana in public, it's, it's so I have so many thoughts about it, but the practice of drug testing in public hospitals for marijuana, while the private hospitals in Manhattan can do what they please when it comes to testing their patients for any substance. What it does is produce this proof that it's only the folks who are going to public hospitals that are using controlled substances, because we actually don't have the data on what is happening in the private hospitals in New York City. So there's the knowledge production that's involved in that policy is terrifying. What's also terrifying is it's myopic, right? And it's focused on how the state can act to protect children, right? Because presumably that's the motivation behind the law. Like if we find out that a woman has smoked marijuana within, I don't know, what a month of delivery, then, we have identified an incompetent person and we can protect the child by either surveilling the family or removing the child from the mother's care. As Michele so brilliantly shows in Policing the Womb, if the state were actually interested in protecting children, there are so many other things that it could do. Poverty is known to cause harm to fetuses, right? Food insecurity, housing insecurity, lack of health care, lack of prenatal care to actually screen fetuses for distress, screen the parents of the fetus for nutritional deficiencies, right? Poverty hurts fetuses. what is New York City doing to alleviate poverty? If we're so interested in protecting children, screening mothers for marijuana is just a myopic, ridiculous, ineffective, but also justice denying method of going about it.
And you know, to build on what Chiara offered there, especially the knowledge production, and to think about this in intersectional ways, right? Because you've just landed on one of the questions of our viewers that touches many different aspects of life, right? So it's reproductive, it's criminal, it's the medical sphere. And it makes me think about, and this point about knowledge production, about how people who are even sympathetic to the fact that there's mass incarceration will say, oh, but it is so true that, people of color just commit more crime. And I say, no, that's not the case, right? It is that police choose to police outside the gates of Yale and not inside the gates of Yale Thursday through Monday, because they could find just as much marijuana use, illicit drug use, controlled substance use, underage drinking inside the gate. And I'm not picking on Yale. We could go to campuses all across the country, right? But we choose not to do that type of knowledge production. So instead, it looks like, oh, those black and brown poor people, they're just using so much marijuana. And, any of us who've taken a flight before being quarantined in our homes, now that, like, if you look at the magazines now on flights, there are advertisements, right, for which brand of marijuana do you want? Here are 40, 50 different kind of flavors. And who owns these dispensaries? Well, they're not poor black and brown people, right? These are now the kind of white hipster kids who are 30-something, and you just see these grave disparities in our society, the policing and testing of some people. Meanwhile, while you're flying in a plane, you can see the adverts from Denver and other places where the hipsters can now sell you as much marijuana as you want. And it's really still a tale of two different cities.
It is. So we've got 4 minutes. Dahlia,
can I just say
quickly
one quick thing? I think we talked about this in our prep call, but it should be made explicit, because I do think it goes to Michelle's point about how the aperture is just too narrow all the time. So every woman that I know is out of her mind this week because Ohio and Texas are now trying to shut down abortion clinics as non-essential medical services. And that is stipulated, horrifying, but it is such a tiny tip of the iceberg. And I think the reason Michelle's trying to get us to widen the lens here is because, as you said, New York, incredibly blue, incredibly liberal, incredibly progressive town, is just as complicit in some of the worst forms of, reproductive injustices. And we just sort of find a way to elide that as a problem. And I really think, when I took away from Michelle's book, and what I urge people to take away, is that if you think you know what the problem is, you don't know what the problem is. It's huge, and it really happens on sort of all sorts of matrices that are invisible to us. I mean, Michelle's talking about invisible women, but it is invisible, this whole superstructure of what's wrong. And I just think that's the point. That for me is the takeaway, that we get very, very focused on June Medical and don't realize that this term the court's hearing another Little Sisters case that could take away reproductive freedom for women. It's a huge problem, and we get very, very focused on whatever the sort of cause du jour is. It usually really means missing where people on the ground are hurt most.
So much of our reproductive rights strategy is reactive, is defensive, is waiting for the other side to act, and then we go to court and litigate and try to keep those bad laws from going into effect. I want to end on a up-ish note and also reflect another question from one of our viewers, which is, what should we be doing if not that defensive work? And Michele, I'm going to ask you to be super brief, just to lift up where you end with the book, which is this reproductive justice Bill of Rights or reproductive justice New Deal. And you've got an affirmative program for us. And that's why you all have to read the book to learn more about it. But just briefly, Michele, what is that Bill of Rights, that New Deal?
So to be very clear, it's casting a new framework and giving policy structure to thinking about reproductive health, rights, and justice as being something that should be foundationally important to our nation, to our Constitution, to states' constitutions. And so there are, what, about 8 different prongs or 9 different prongs of it that understand that reproductive health, rights, and justice encompasses every aspect of our lives in making sure that we have access to the appropriate kind of healthcare, appropriate kinds of institutional structures in our lives that lift us up and that lift up the children we want to have. And it does all of that. I commend folks to read it because as I was thinking about it, it's not enough to just take issues to court. What we really do need to do is to sort of think about the policy side, and that's what that Reproductive Justice Bill of Rights does in the book.
So as a reminder, this is the book, Michele Goodwin's Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Carol, hold yours up too.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, there we go. And the book, and I'll remind you that Michele doesn't have one with her because they've been selling so fast. They've been sold out from under her. So order the book now from your local bookstore who can mail it to you, not necessarily from Amazon. I want to thank all of you. First of all, Michele, for writing this book. It's just so incredible. It's devastating and also uplifting at once. Order the book and read it with your friends. I want to thank Professor Carol Sanger from Columbia being with us, Kiara Bridges, Professor of Law at the University of California Law School at Berkeley, and Dahlia Lithwick for being with us also, who's a senior legal correspondent at Slate. Thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. They were so good. I shouldn't have asked any, and we should have just relied on your questions. So get the book. Thank you so much, Michele, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all. I very much appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.